It was a Sunday morning in late November when a passerby noticed something unusual in the woods. Near a shallow stream, tucked beneath a mess of fallen branches, lay a small, fragile figure, still, silent, and alone. That place was Cadzow Glen, a quiet park in the centre of Hamilton, Scotland, and the person found there was Amber Gibson. She had been reported missing 2 days earlier. The discovery raised far more questions than it answered. Why had nobody come forward sooner? Why was her clothing found separately? And why had someone called the children's home where she lived, pretending that she was still safe? The final hours of Amber's life would turn out to be deeply disturbing. This is one of the worst cases I've ever covered. Amber Gibson didn't get the kind of start in life that most children do. By the age of 3, she and her older brother Connor had both been removed from their birth family and then placed into the foster care system. They were taken in by Craig and Carol Niven, and they cared for the siblings as their own and eventually became their permanent guardians. Amber grew up creative, expressive, and full of potential. She loved art, music, and animals. Her foster parents later described her as compassionate and resilient, with an energy that lit up the room. But it was clear from an early age that Amber carried a heavy emotional weight, and the same was true for brother Connor. The siblings' early years had left lasting effects, and while the Nivens did their best to provide structure and love, there were always ongoing challenges. As Amber entered her teenage years, her support needs increased, and sadly at the age of 13, she was moved back into the care system. Connor remained in the Niven home until he turned 18, and he then moved into supported accommodation. By late 2021, Amber was living at the Hillside Children's Home in Hamilton. Connor was staying just a few miles away at the Blue Triangle Homeless Hostel. Though they'd spent long stretches of their childhood apart, the siblings reconnected that year. They began messaging once again. Amber, now 16, seemed hopeful about rekindling a relationship with her brother. To her, it was a chance for a fresh start. And on the evening of November 26th, Amber told staff at the children's home that she was heading out to meet him. Amber seemed like she was really excited. Her phone was running low on battery, so she left Connor's number with the office. This was just in case. And then she walked out into the night. Connor and Amber weren't just difficult siblings. They were described by their long-term foster father as a dangerous mix. In fact, Craig Niven later testified in court that the two of them could not be left alone together. He said that they argued often, and that something about their dynamic just felt off, especially as they grew older. There were no physical attacks reported between them under his roof, but there was an undercurrent of tension that never settled. So when Amber reconnected with Connor in late 2021, after they'd both left the foster home, it was with a very cautious hope. Amber's time in care hadn't been easy at all. In June of that year, she had been SA'd by a man named Jamie Stars while she was asleep or unconscious in his flat. She bravely reported him, and her testimony led to a conviction. Jamie Stars was sentenced to over 10 years in prison. But that trauma, layered on top of a chaotic upbringing, still didn't stop Amber from trying to rebuild, but it definitely left her a little more vulnerable. The staff at Hill House Children's Unit didn't forbid Amber from seeing her brother, but they were definitely wary. One support worker tried to dissuade her from going out on that night, saying that it was too cold and too dark, but Amber insisted. After all, it was only her brother, so what could really go wrong? What none of them knew at this time was that Connor had recently become unstable, grown more isolated and more volatile. She didn't know that he would make a phone call later that night that would sound caring on the surface, but absolutely horrifying in hindsight. On the night of Friday, November 26th, Amber left her children's unit just after 9:15 p.m. She walked alone through the cold, wintry streets of Hamilton on her way to meet Connor in the town centre. By 10 p.m, the siblings were captured together on CCTV. This was near Cadzow Glen. In the image of Amber, she's smiling beside her brother. completely unaware of how important this image would later become. They were still walking together when they reached the footbridge near the park, but then Amber wasn't seen again. By 11:30 p.m, Connor appeared alone on CCTV. He was now walking away from the wooded area. He was now visibly muddy and dishevelled. His jacket, t-shirt and shorts were all now stained with red. But whatever had happened, Connor didn't seem panicked. He just walked calmly back into the Blue Triangle office and slumped into a chair. Staff did notice that his hands were filthy and that he had some small cuts on his legs and what looked like scratches across his arms, but he just told them that he'd fallen into a ditch. He then asked to use the office telephone. Connor then called Hill House, the children's unit where Amber lived. He asked them if his sister had returned safely. The staff member who answered the phone said that this call gave her a bad feeling. She said that Connor seemed evasive and confused. He told her that they'd had an argument and that Amber had stormed off, but he couldn't tell her where. Later that night, Connor showered, he changed his clothes, and he then headed back outside with a plastic bag. The next day, he sent Amber a text message, and it read, "Are you okay?" That message was never opened. At Hill House Children's Unit, staff were growing more and more anxious. Amber hadn't returned by curfew. She wasn't answering her phone either. By the following morning, Saturday, November the 27th, her absence had now become alarming. A support worker contacted Connor, and he once again told them that Amber had just stormed off after an argument, but he couldn't give a time or a location. His answers were very vague, and when he was warned that the police would now be notified, he became defensive. Staff called the police, a missing persons report was filed, and search teams began canvassing Hamilton. Amber had never run away before, so this was a real cause for concern. On Sunday morning, 2 days after she was last seen, police officers arrived at Cadzow Glen following a report of a body found. This was Amber.
Amber Gibson, sometimes known as Amber Niven, wasn't doing anything different to any other 16-year-old on the night she went missing, according to police who are now investigating her murder.
A 16-year-old death is absolutely tragic, and certainly when it's from a homicide, so our focus is to understand Amber's last movements so that we can provide some answers to her loved ones.
Amber was reported missing from the town of Hamilton just before 10 p.m. on Friday. She was last seen on Cadzow Street after leaving home in the Hill House area around 9:15 that night. On Sunday morning, just after 10 a.m, emergency services were alerted to a body near Cadzow Glen. The next day, police formally identified the body as the missing teenager. Her death was being treated as unexplained before a murder investigation was launched on Tuesday. The park remained sealed off today, the investigation happening in the shadow of a residential street.
Just utterly shocked, really can't believe it. It's far too close to home, it's really frightening.
It's a worry that girls, especially young girls, can't walk about at night time without things like this happening to them.
Police say a key part of their investigation is to establish whether Amber knew her attacker, as they try to work out what happened in the hours leading up to the death of a 16-year-old girl who had her whole future in front of her. Well, Amber's family and loved ones are, as you'd expect, said to be devastated by her death, and people who live here are left with a lot of questions as police try to reassure them in the absence of any arrests. This park is less than a 10-minute walk from Hamilton Town Centre, which they say would have been very busy at the time she was last seen. Just the smallest detail could help them move this investigation forward.
Her body was caked in mud. Her clothing had been torn. There were bruises across her neck, head and limbs. There were 15 separate injuries to her face and skull alone. A short distance away, investigators found her mobile phone. It had been smashed into 3 pieces. Her jacket that once kept her warm was now lying in the stream.
Amber was such a well-loved, bright and lively young girl who attended as a day pupil at our academy in Bathgate. Our children and staff were all devastated by the news of this tragedy and are all working together to support each other at this difficult time. Our sympathies extend to all of Amber's loved ones and to everyone who knew her.
Brother Connor posted a tribute to Amber on Facebook. It read, "Amber, you will fly high for the rest of time. We will all miss you, especially me. I love you, Ginger Midget. Goodbye for now." But the very next day, he was arrested. The CCTV footage told a real story. From 9:51 p.m. to 10 p.m, cameras in central Hamilton captured Connor walking with Amber. First they were by the shops, and then they moved on to the wooded entrance to Cadzow Glen. They were seen laughing. In fact, Amber even took a photo. She sent that image to a friend with the caption, "My big bro." They then vanished from the camera's view, and the next frame tells a different story. Connor reappears at 11:38 p.m. He's now on a nearby street, alone, looking dishevelled. Amber was nowhere to be seen, but had she stormed off as Connor said, or had something else happened? Just after midnight, a new camera picked him up once again. This time it was at the entrance to the Blue Triangle hostel. Now he's wearing different clothes, and just minutes later the camera captures him leaving once again. This time he's carrying a plastic bag. He moves out of frame and towards the hostel's wheelie bins. When he returns, that bag is gone. In a truly disturbing twist, Connor was not the only man that police were looking at in conjunction with the investigation into Amber. And this really is one of the most horrifying and bizarre things I've ever seen. Another man was involved, a man named Stephen Corrigan. He was 45 years old, and he was completely unknown to both siblings. And to all available evidence, it appears that completely by accident, Stephen came across Amber's body in the 2 days between her passing and when the police were finally alerted. And instead of calling for help, he decided to touch her in a violating manner. He then concealed her under more branches and foliage. So, yes, just to reiterate, this man found a murder victim, and he chose to do that rather than call for help. He later told police that if his DNA was on her, it must have been from relieving himself in the bushes months earlier. His father, William, aged 79, also stood up for his son, claiming that he was completely innocent. He said that he was with him at his home in Blantyre between the 26th and 28th of November 2021. However, forensic biologists were clear. His DNA was found in 39 locations on Amber's body. This included locations that would have been covered by her clothing. And his DNA wasn't simply present on the scene, it was concentrated. It matched skin cells and saliva. There was no other reasonable explanation for how his genetic material could get there, except for real and disgusting contact. The judge would later tell Corrigan, any decent human being, on coming across the naked body of a young girl, would immediately call the emergency services. You, on the other hand, did not. And for those choices that he made, for what he did do and for what he didn't do, he would face some real consequences of his own. However, first, both men had to stand trial. Connor Gibson's trial began in July of 2023 at the High Court in Glasgow. He denied all charges. He claimed that he'd simply argued with Amber and walked away. He couldn't explain the red DNA on his clothing, the DNA on her body, or the evidence in the bin. You see, police would investigate that bin outside the hostel and find a white Levi t-shirt, a pair of red-stained grey shorts and a face mask. Amber's DNA was on them, and so was Connor's. Forensic biologists concluded that the only logical explanation for the red, for the transfer of skin cells, and for the damage to Amber's clothing was that Connor had attacked her. He had forcibly removed her clothing, he violated her, and then he left her alone in the woods, partially buried under branches. His defense lawyer did admit that he had assaulted her, but he also insisted that he didn't mean to end her time on this earth. The prosecution laid out 21 different points of evidence, all linking Connor directly to Amber's violation, attack, and murder. There was DNA, CCTV, texts, phone calls, and lies. Perhaps the most chilling detail came from the pathologist. Amber's time had come to an end by manual pressure to the neck, and this means that the final thing she saw was the face of her brother. On September the 4th, 2023, Connor Gibson stood silently in the dock at the High Court in Livingston. He was sentenced to life in prison. He must serve at least 22 years, at which point he can apply for parole.
You've been convicted of the physical assault and murder of your younger sister, Amber Niven, as she liked to be known. Like you, she had not had the best start in life, being fostered and then residing in a children's home. She also had to deal with having been raped. She would have looked to you as a big brother for support. She was looking forward to meeting up with you on the night she was murdered. She even posted a selfie of both of you on Snapchat. You walked with her to Cadzow Glen. There you beat her about the head, breaking her nose, removed her clothing, and assaulted her with intent to rape, and then manually strangled her to death. The last person she saw alive was you, her brother, strangling the life out of her, having beaten her up and tried to rape her. What you did was truly evil. In sentencing you, I take into account your age, your difficult background, everything that's been said on your behalf, background report, your lack of criminal record, and of course the circumstances of your appalling crimes. I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment.
Stephen Corrigan was sentenced at the same hearing. He received 9 years for interfering with Amber's body and attempting to conceal it.
A depraved case. I mean, that word was used in court today.
It was, and in fact the judge also used the word evil to describe Connor Gibson's crimes, which, as you rightly say, he will now spend the rest of his life in prison, a minimum of 22 years before he will be considered, and the judge stressed, considered for release on parole. Now, the crime itself was, as you say, a depraved one. Connor Gibson walked his younger sister, 16-year-old Amber, to Parklands. He then proceeded to try and cover up his crimes. He lied repeatedly, in the words of the judge, before CCTV footage and indeed forensic evidence ultimately exposed his lies, and he was convicted after a 2-week trial.
The Nivens, Amber and Connor's former foster parents, were present in court. After the verdict, they released a quiet, devastating statement. We now have one daughter buried in Larkhall Cemetery and another child in prison. Life will never be the same. They also said what many had come to believe, that Amber had been failed by the care system, failed by social services, failed by so many people that were meant to protect her, and failed by the one person that she should have been able to trust the most, her big brother. I just find it so awful that Amber was failed so many times, and on top of that, a random man then disrespected her this one final time. The world really is just so awful sometimes. What are we doing? Poor, poor girl.
It's Aaron Campbell here again for another video. So I just wanted to say thank you guys very much for 50 subscribers. Even though I'm nearly at 80, the 50 is just a better, it's a rounder number.
The streets of Rothersay were quiet, more silent than usual, even for this remote pocket of Scotland. It was the kind of summer night where windows stayed open and waves gently tapped against the shore. But at exactly 1:54 AM, a male stepped into the dark with something horrifying hidden in his clothing. CCTV would later catch him slipping out of his house, hood up, eyes low, walking toward Ardbeg Road, the very same street where 6-year-old Alesha MacPhail was sleeping, curled up under a blanket, with a Peppa Pig DVD menu looping on the TV. Tony McLaughlin had been asleep for just under 2 hours when Aaron first tried to reach her. Her phone vibrated quietly on the bedside table. 1:47 AM, and then again 1:48 AM. Tony didn't hear either of them. Then the messages came later. Aaron had once been a regular customer, buying illicit substances from Tony and her boyfriend Robert, who was also Alesha's father. But this arrangement had fallen apart months earlier after a petty falling out, and Tony hadn't spoken to him since. She would later say that she had no idea why Aaron was trying to contact her that night. But we would later discover that his timing wasn't just strange, it was actually chilling. Callum MacPhail's alarm went off just after 6 a.m. He was due to start work early and had a quiet routine. Kettle on, boots by the back door, check on the sleeping household. But today, something was off. The door to Alesha's bedroom, usually shut, but today it was slightly ajar. He peered in, and the bed was empty. As he started checking through the rest of the home, he saw that she wasn't in the bathroom, nor on the sofa, not curled up under a blanket after waking up early. Callum's chest began to tighten. Quickly, the whole family tore through the home, calling her name. They checked everywhere, under beds, inside wardrobes, out into the garden. There they saw her bike and scooter sat untouched. Angela King, Alesha's grandmother, grabbed the phone and dialed 999 at 6:23 a.m. She then made a public Facebook appeal just moments later. Has anyone seen our granddaughter? She's only 6. Please, please help. Angela would later describe watching an ambulance rush past their home, towards the hotel ruins in the hills. In that moment, she felt her stomach sink. If that's my granddaughter up there, Callum told officers, then I want to know. The day before had been almost perfect. She spent it doing the things that she loved, playing at the park, paddling in the sea, laughing on the ferry home from a birthday party that wasn't even hers. She'd made a new friend and chased a balloon along the beach until it popped. She stole a slice of pizza from her dad's plate with a giggle. She was on the Isle of Bute for the first half of her summer holiday, staying with her father, Robert, his girlfriend, Tony, and her grandparents in their seafront flat along Ardbeg Road. That night, Alesha was playful and hyper. Perhaps it was the sugar from the party. She was annoying her grandpa Callum by bouncing on his bed and hitting him with a deflating balloon. And she ended that evening the same way that she always did, with a cuddle. "Good night, Grandpa," she said, and she was tucked in at around 10:30 p.m, and the Peppa Pig DVD was left on. By sunrise, the entire island was looking for her. Locals walked the shoreline. Volunteers from the Bute Resilience Team knocked on doors. A Coast Guard helicopter hovered over rooftops. Angela King's Facebook post spread quickly, and within just minutes, George Williams, who lived near the abandoned Kyle's Hydropathic Hotel, read the status and then joined the search. He walked the wooded path behind his home towards the overgrown hotel ruins, and there, at 8:54 a.m, the search was over. In the trees, lying on her side in the dirt, was that small, fragile body, with no clothing. George crouched down and checked for a pulse. Then he stood trembling and dialed 999. His words, "I found the wee girl. She's dead." Paramedics arrived within minutes, followed by the first police unit. Detectives quickly confirmed the unthinkable. This was Alesha. They later calculated the walk from her bed to this location would take just 15 to 17 minutes. When police examined the soles of her feet, they found no marks, no dirt, and no damage. So this meant that she hadn't walked to her final location. Instead, she must have been carried. At Rothersay police station, a quiet room had already been prepared. A uniformed officer closed the door behind them. "We found her, but she has passed. She was just 900 metres away, found lying on her side."
What I can say is that I confirm now that the body recovered at Ardbeg Road is that of Alesha MacPhail, who was reported missing around about 6:25 on Monday the 2nd of July. What I can say now is that we are treating her death as a murder investigation.
When the news spread, everybody seemed to get up and start running about. So I think it was just at that time in the mornings, you know what I mean, where people were waking up or just going to work and realising what had happened.
A wee bit later we get a word that the body had been found. We were still kind of hoping for the best, which she was still alive and that, and then we found that she was dead a wee bit later. It just shocked everybody.
Pathologist Dr. John Williams would later describe 117 injuries, some likely caused by vegetation in passing, but some not. There were signs of smothering, pressure to the face and neck. There had been blunt strikes, and then no real attempt to hide her. Her innocence had been destroyed and then discarded right there in the woods. And the person that had done this had already gone back home, washed the red off their hands, and gone back to bed. It was past midnight on the 3rd of July, barely 24 hours since Alesha had been found. This is when Jeanette Campbell reviewed her footage. At first, she had helped to search just like everyone else. She'd assumed that Aaron, her son, was just another worried local teen. She even asked him directly if he knew anything. His response was, "There's no way they'd find my DNA, because I've been nowhere near that wee girl." Still though, something nagged at the mother. This led her to searching through her CCTV feed from the cameras that were mounted on their home, and now a whole new nightmare was about to unfold. She watched Aaron leave at 1:54 a.m, then return at 3:35, before leaving again at 3:44 wearing only shorts. He then returned once more, before leaving again at 3:58, this time in a different outfit. Grey t-shirt, shorts, dark shoes, and a torch in his hand. Finally, he returned for the last time at 4:07 a.m. Each trip was extremely short, which suggests that maybe they were purposeful. Jeanette froze. He had left the house 3 times, during the very hours that Alesha must have vanished, and for some reason her son never mentioned this. The mother now had to decide what to do next. She brought the footage to the police herself. She did this, she would later say, simply to remove him from suspicion. Tony had been the last adult to see Alesha alive just after 11 p.m. She had quietly entered her room to turn off the Peppa Pig DVD. Alesha had already fallen asleep, her face turned gently to the wall. Tony would later describe her in court as peaceful, her hair fanned out across the pillow, breathing softly, still. She whispered goodnight and then closed the door, and off she went to her own bed. Then, just hours later, when she saw those missed calls, she didn't think much of it. But at 6:29 a.m, as panic swept through the flat, she tried calling Aaron back, but he didn't answer. At 9:01 a.m, his response came, "Sorry, doesn't matter," with 2 laughing emojis. And then when she told him that Alesha was missing, he replied, "Oh damn, I'm sure she's not went too far. Kiss." But sadly, she had. Aaron Campbell had hosted the kind of party that could only really happen in a small island town. There were 15 teenagers packed into a modest home, the cheap cider was flowing, and smoke from the devil's lettuce was wafting out the windows. And then, by midnight, the last guest had left, all except one. A friend returned at 12:30 a.m, and they found Aaron alone in bed looking off. He was curled up, eyes wide, saying that he felt suicidal. He just had a big argument with his mother, so big in fact that furniture had been broken. There had been a lot of yelling. He said that he just needed to clear his head, said that he just wanted to get stoned. Aaron started messaging people, 3 in total, asking if anyone had any green. This included Robert MacPhail and Tony McLaughlin. Just to reiterate, Tony was not Alesha's mother, but she was the partner of Robert, who was Alesha's father. Nobody that he sent a message to replied, but by then his decision had already been made. By the next day, forensics teams had found his DNA on Alesha's neck, face and clothing. The odds of it being anyone else were 1 in a billion. The courtroom was still. Aaron Campbell took the stand himself. He was calm and articulate. He appeared to be unshaken by the whole thing. He told the jury that he had never even met Alesha, that he was out looking for his lost phone, that he had slept with Tony McLaughlin that night, his ex-dealer's girlfriend, and that she had done this to Alesha out of jealousy. He said that she had used a discarded prophylactic from their encounter to plant his DNA on the child's body. Tony broke down during testimony. "I loved her to pieces," she said of Alesha. And Angela King, Alesha's grandmother, described the relationship between the two as great. The prosecution asked Aaron if he understood what it meant to accuse an innocent person of such a crime. Aaron replied without hesitation, "It would be evil." All eyes in the courtroom were on him. He met the prosecutor's gaze, steady and expressionless. It had taken days to present all the evidence. The CCTV, the DNA, the fibre analysis, digital records, Snapchat videos and chilling old messages. But this one single moment, was the trial's clearest window into who he really was. And by the end of it, the jury didn't take long. They deliberated for just 3 hours and made a unanimous decision. He was guilty of abduction. He was guilty of the violation. He was guilty of murder.
Today it was revealed that the 16-year-old who killed her was on the radar of police and social services. Alesha's family is now demanding to know why Aaron Campbell was allowed to slip through the net.
Something could have been done, that there could have been further action taken to make sure that this never happened. It hurts quite a lot, and on top of that, I don't want anything like this to happen to anyone else.
Alesha's family only found out services were involved because of this leaked report. It's Argyll and Bute Council's review of the case, published 6 months ago. It shows Aaron Campbell had been referred to the Youth Justice Service twice, and he was being monitored. But the review says he had not reached their threshold for harmful behaviours protocol.
It hurts knowing the fact that they took a look at this person, said, oh, well, we don't think he's that bad yet. It then took the life of my niece for them then to turn around and go, well, maybe we do need to review it. At that point in time, they've failed at their job and they've also failed in their community.
A statement from the Council's Health and Social Care Partnership says, we went beyond what's required from an initial review and carried out a thorough multi-agency assessment of what happened. This robust process has evidence that a crime of this nature could not have been foreseen. How do you feel your family's been treated?
Shockingly.
The judge described the crimes as some of the most wicked and evil that he had ever seen. And this wasn't over yet, because after the verdict, there was still even more to come. Aaron Campbell would eventually speak openly, not to the police nor in the courtroom, but to a forensic psychologist, Dr. Gary McPherson, in a post-trial interview ahead of sentencing. It was a chilling encounter. Aaron described how, when he saw Alesha sleeping, he felt a moment of opportunity. All I thought about was killing her, he said. He admitted absolutely everything, carrying her out to the flat, lying to her when she asked him who he was, then disgustingly violating her before ending her time on this earth. He also described returning to the scene when he realised that he'd dropped his phone and needed to find it. When asked about how he felt about what he'd done, Aaron replied that he was quite satisfied with the murder. He added that it had taken everything to stop laughing during parts of the trial. The psychologist noted that Aaron still experienced fantasies about harming others. This included minors and included those who had already passed.
You gave her your top because she was cold. I will not go into the horrific and cold-blooded details of what you said you did to her, but you explained that after you murdered Alesha, you threw your stained clothing into the sea, had a shower, and then went back where you left her to retrieve your phone. Dr. McPherson reports that you told him that over the next few days you were totally unconcerned, other than to be mildly amused that the police had not arrested you. The only sentence I can impose on you is detention without limit of time. In addition, you will be subject to the notification provisions of the Offences Act 2003 for an indefinite period. However, I also have to specify a period which must pass before you can apply for release on parole. Whether you will ever be released will be for others to determine. But as matters stand, a lot of work will have to be done to change you before that could be considered. It may even be impossible. The period I select is known as the punishment part of the sentence, and its purpose is to satisfy the requirements of retribution and deterrence. The parole board will deal in due course with the protection of the public. The nature of these appalling offences and what I have read in the reports make it clear to me that reintegration and rehabilitation, while these are important considerations, are remote possibilities, and neither your best interests nor anyone else's will be served by a speedy return to the community. Nonetheless, the punishment part will not be as long as it would have been had you been an adult. Your sentence will run from 6 July 2018. You will be detained without limit of time, and I fix the punishment part at 27 years. That is all.
On March the 21st, 2019, Judge Lord Matthews sentenced him to life with a minimum term of 27 years. He was 16 years old. This was later reduced on appeal to 24 years. Lord Matthews said that Aaron was a cold, calculating, remorseless and dangerous individual, completely lacking in victim empathy. He stressed that Aaron's claim about Tony McLaughlin had been a travesty of the truth. She is completely innocent, the judge said. Still, Aaron showed no emotion, not even as Alesha's mother, Georgina, shouted at him from across the courtroom. The Isle of Bute never really recovered, not really. A place once seen as safe and scenic became the scene of one of Scotland's most shocking crimes in living history. Alesha's school in Airdrie built a playhouse in her honour. Her classmates helped design it. The public donated £22,000. Her family planted flowers, sang songs and read poems. At her funeral, her uncle called her the brightest thing. Pink ribbons lined the streets. A bubble machine sent soft bubbles into the sky as mourners wept. She had wanted a bubble party for her next birthday, but she would not live to see it. The last photo that Phoenix Spencer Horn ever posted online shows her smiling. She's nestled into the arms of the man that she believed was her soulmate. He's holding her by the neck. It looks playful, maybe even loving. She's about to kiss him, but his eyes are locked on the camera and not her. Phoenix was 21 years old. She worked 2 jobs. She made the perfect latte every time, and she had a laugh that you could hear from across the street. Her friends called her Fee. Her mum called her my darling angel, and Ewan called her his forever. This case reveals the depths of human behaviour and how just when you think things can't get any worse, someone somewhere finds a way to keep you shocked. Phoenix Spencer Horn grew up in Strathaven, which I've seen is actually pronounced Straven. It's a tight-knit Scottish market town, just south of Glasgow. I actually had a little walk around on Google Maps and it does look nice. Phoenix had the kind of warmth that couldn't be faked. Customers at the cafe that she worked in would ask for her by name. Her colleagues described her as light-hearted, hard-working and full of energy. Outside of work, she lived a pretty simple life. Coffee, music, friends, her mum. Her smile turned heads, but her kindness is what made people stay. She had dreams like any 21-year-old. She loved animals. She posted wholesome montages, fun dances and life updates on TikTok. And she did believe in love. In one post, she described her boyfriend Ewan as her soulmate. Underneath a collage of couple photos, she wrote, "Life's purpose is finding your soulmate. Life is so much more beautiful and full of colour with you. This is only the beginning of our forever." But that forever came to a stop on November the 16th, 2024. And everything that Phoenix had built, the homes, the relationships, the dreams, all of that was shattered in one night. When the news broke, her town was shattered. Friends wept publicly. Local businesses lit candles, and they wrote her name in chalk outside their doors. The cafe that she once worked at kept her name on the rota for weeks, just in case it had all been a terrible mistake. But it wasn't. Phoenix was gone, and what her family would soon learn was even worse than they had imagined. Phoenix and Ewan had met at a family party in 2022. He was a postman, quiet and reserved. He was a little awkward, but it said that he could be charming when he wanted to be. They then moved into the top floor flat in East Kilbride, not far from where Phoenix worked, at both the Straven Hotel and a local cafe. The place was perfect to manage her busy life. It was small, but it was theirs, and Phoenix made it feel like home. To the outside world, they looked like a young couple settling into adult life, but there were cracks forming below the surface. Messages revealed that Ewan often complained of feeling lonely when Phoenix was working her evening shifts. Phoenix, ever considerate, apologised. On her final day on this earth, she spent the morning in good spirits, serving customers and texting her mum. Ewan had worked a postal shift that morning and told a colleague that he was going home to chill. That evening, he ordered a takeaway. Phoenix then arrived home and messaged her mum at 9:37 p.m. saying, "All good, just having dinner." This was the last time that Alison Spencer would ever hear from her daughter. Just hours later, neighbours in the building reported a sudden loud bang and the sound of hurried footsteps overhead. At that exact moment, an app on Ewan's phone, one that tracked his daily footsteps, registered a sudden burst of movement. This was at 12:13 a.m. Something had happened inside that flat, and then Phoenix was never seen again. By Monday, November the 18th, Phoenix had missed 2 shifts. Her mum, Alison, was now frantic. She called, she messaged, she even asked Ewan directly where her daughter was. He said that Phoenix was sleeping, said that she'd text her later, but Alison just wasn't buying it anymore. She made the decision to call the police. Officers arrived at the Glenlee flat just after noon. They knocked and Ewan answered the door. He was said to be calm and polite. Ewan then let the police officers in, but what they found inside changed everything. Just for a moment, can you imagine knowing that you've done something very, very bad, and you know as the police walk into your home, you are about to get found out? I wonder if somehow there was some magical thinking, like thinking that something would happen and you'd somehow get away with it. I know it's a tiny part of the case, but when we consider that it's human beings doing these terrible things, we also have to accept that they'll have these strange human moments, and I just find that really unimaginable to think what that moment must actually be like. And when police indeed entered, they saw Phoenix was lying in the hallway. She was completely unclothed. Her body had been desecrated, her head removed. There were obvious signs of attempted dismemberment. Red-stained sharp implements were scattered, one in the hallway, another in the bathroom, and a third in the bedroom. Phoenix had been arranged in a horrifying pose. Her head had been placed upright, tucked beneath her left arm. It was clear that this hadn't been done in a moment of panic. This was a sick display of a deeply troubled and arguably evil man. And when officers asked him if Phoenix could still be alive, Ewan replied flatly, "I know she is dead, mate. She is dead." Then he added something else chilling. "I couldn't stay here with her like that. I tried to dismember her. I moved her from the bath and put her there." Ewan Methven was arrested on the spot, obviously. He was still calm, still detached, and according to officers, he was just focused on how this would all affect him. In the back of the police car, he mumbled, "I guess this is what my next 25 years look like." He was taken into custody. Interestingly, Mother Alison wasn't the only person that contacted the police. Ewan also dialed 999. He told the operator, "The past day I've been trying to muster up the courage to phone. I totally blacked out through the whole thing." But that claim didn't hold. It didn't stand up well in court, not with the forensic timeline, and definitely not with Phoenix's family. Meanwhile, back at the flat, forensic teams began the grim task of collecting evidence. The app on his phone had logged hundreds of steps at around midnight, and this matched up to the time that neighbours heard the disturbance. His search history and digital footprint showed a sharp contrast between text messages sent to Phoenix's mum and then the websites that he was browsing just minutes later. There was no sign of forced entry, no defensive wounds on Phoenix, nothing that suggested a prolonged struggle. This was just an overwhelming, overpowering, controlled attack. Ewan would later claim that this attack had been caused by a psychotic break. He said that he had taken substances, alcohol and steroids, that he believed the substances had been spiked. However, there was no evidence of a blackout. There was no evidence that he had been hallucinating, and there was no remorse shown in the 2 days that he spent hiding the body, that he made 170 searches for adult content, and where he pretended that his girlfriend was alive to her own mother. When the case finally reached the High Court in Glasgow, Ewan Methven pleaded guilty to murder and to attempting to defeat the ends of justice. No one saw what happened inside the flat that night, but prosecutors would later piece it together through forensics, phone data, and Ewan's own eventual confession. Shortly after midnight, Ewan attacked Phoenix. He throttled her, compressing her neck. He then repeatedly jabbed her with 3 separate sharp implements, 20 sharp impacts in total. The fatal wound pierced her chest. There were other injuries too to her face and body. They painted a picture of overwhelming rage. After the frenzy of the attack, Ewan seemingly had a period of calm. He didn't flee. Instead, he moved her body from the bath to the hallway. Then he covered her up. And over the next 48 hours, he stayed in that flat with her. At one point, he tried to dismantle her. Her head was removed. He also began sawing at her torso, her wrist, and her ankle. The next morning, Phoenix's mother began texting as normal. Ewan replied, pretending to be his girlfriend. He wrote, "Hey, sorry, I've just woken up." Later, another text read, "All good." He wanted her mother to believe that everything was fine, that Phoenix was still alive. And strangely, just minutes after those text messages, Ewan then logged onto adult websites. In fact, over the course of that Sunday, he accessed explicit content 170 times. He also drove Phoenix's red Corsa around town. He made attempts to buy more illicit substances, and he made no attempt to call for help. By Monday morning, though, his story was falling apart. Phoenix now hadn't shown up for work, and her mother was done believing the lies. The court also heard from a delivery driver that delivered to the flat at around 8 p.m. on the night in question. The delivery driver said that Ewan did not appear to be drunk or under the influence. So this also goes against what Ewan was claiming, unless he took what he took, and its effects were quite fast at taking over his entire being. And then these effects continued for 2 further days. It just doesn't really seem realistic. The prosecutor, Chris McKenna, laid it out plainly. This was a deliberate act, he said, an attempt to conceal a crime, not a psychotic break. And the judge agreed. Lord Matthews called it an appalling and horrible crime. He said he had rarely heard such outpourings of grief as those in the victim impact statements. Phoenix's family had written to the court. Their words tried to describe the indescribable. They spoke about her perfect coffees, her joy, her smile, and the silence that now sat heavy in their home. Mum Alison wrote that their hearts had been shattered and broken forever, that life without Fee would never be whole again. When Ewan was finally sentenced, he barely reacted. There was just a blank stare. He was ordered to serve a minimum of 23 years. This would be a life sentence.
She was standing at the threshold of what should have been a long and fulfilling life. You were a trusted member of her family, but you betrayed that trust and robbed her of life in the cruelest way. I will not repeat all of the harrowing details that were read out in court on the last occasion you appeared. It is enough to say that for reasons no one will ever understand, and in the flat you shared with her, you strangled her and stabbed her 20 times, 10 of these in the face. Not content with what you had done to her, you robbed her of all dignity in death by decapitating her and trying to dismember her in an attempt to defeat the ends of justice. For 2 days after you murdered Phoenix, you indulged in drug abuse and watched pornography, pretending by text to her mother that you were her. I have rarely read such outpourings of grief as are contained in the victim impact statements from her family, who have endeavoured to put into words what can never truly be encapsulated, the sadness and the deep sense of loss they all feel and will continue to feel thanks to what you did. The way you treated this innocent young woman after her death meant that her family did not even have the comfort of saying goodbye to her. I know that nothing I can say or do and no punishment I can inflict will ever be enough. The only sentence I can pass on the charge of murder is one of imprisonment for life. I also have to impose a period which must pass, known as the punishment part of the sentence, before you can apply for parole. Whether or not you are ever released on licence, if ever, will be a matter for others to decide. I have this morning seen a letter written by you, but it answers none of the questions which must be plaguing the family. You blame the effect of substances, but that is no excuse. I have taken account of all the circumstances, the contents of the report, and everything said by your counsel, although in truth the only matters of any consequence are your lack of record and the fact that you pleaded guilty.
And in that moment in the courtroom, a man in a black suit stood up and shouted just one word. He said, "Beast." In the days after Phoenix's time came to an end, her family created a fundraising page to cover funeral costs. They raised over £6,000. Any remaining funds were donated to Women's Aid. The Glasgow branch posted a tribute that read, "Phoenix should still be here, but her legacy is one that's lifting others up. This is what it means to rise from the ashes." Across Straven, candles were lit in her name. Cafes set out Fee's table for a week of silence. A bench is being carved in her memory. Local artists etched wings around her name. Friends shared her TikToks and her photos, one of which really stood out. Phoenix had captioned it, "Home is wherever I'm with you." It was meant to be romantic, but now it's just a gut punch. Because the place and the person that she did call home became what it ultimately became. Her family gathered again in January to mark what would have been her 21st birthday. They called it her after party. There were balloons, music, photos and laughter, because that's what Phoenix would have wanted. Mother Alison wrote, "We rocked it for her." Phoenix Spencerhorn's name has become more than a memory, and her legacy refuses to fade. It's a summer Friday night in Darlington. Dinner is half made, laughter drifts from the kitchen, and the family dog waits for scraps to fall. Scarlett Vickers, 14, has just come downstairs to join her parents. They've been teasing, throwing food and trading jokes. It feels like the end of any ordinary week. Warm, familiar and safe. But in less than half an hour, that ordinary night will be over. An ambulance will be racing to this very home, and one parent will be telling the police that it was all a freak accident. Exactly what happened in that kitchen would be disputed for months. But one thing that nobody can change is that it would be the last evening that Scarlett would ever see. Scarlett Vickers had been looking forward to the summer holidays. A trip to Gran Canaria was booked, and she'd agreed to get up early the next morning to have breakfast with her relatives. The family lived in a small, close-knit household. It was just her dad Simon, and her mum Sarah Hall. They called themselves the 3 S's. By most accounts, there was no trouble at home. Scarlett's school had no concerns, and police would later find no evidence of discord in the family's phones or messages. Friday, the 5th of July 2024 was nothing unusual. Simon finished work, he smoked a special ciggy, and then he drank some wine whilst watching football on the TV. Mum Sarah cooked spaghetti bolognese in the kitchen. Scarlett spent most of her evening upstairs in her room, but at around 10:15 p.m. she came down. She said that she was bored, and what began as harmless fun would, within just half an hour, leave Scarlett fading fast.
I just want to know how my daughter's doing. We're mucking about playing in the kitchen, and for some reason, this has gone really weird. I mean, we're mucking about. I can't believe this. I don't know what it is. It's just pointless. But what? Please, someone tell me. What's going on?
At the minute, mate, we've got no new information.
We're all in Gran Canaria in 6 weeks. I don't believe it's happening. We're cooking tea. There's nothing about in the kitchen. I don't understand how this is happening.
The Vickers' kitchen was small. It had a breakfast bar on one side and the cooker up against the wall. It wasn't unusual for the family to chat or to tease each other whilst dinner was being prepared. And on that night, Scarlett joined in with her mum and dad's back and forth banter. Sarah was still tending to the food, but she played along too. She was tossing grapes at her daughter. Scarlett tossed them back. Father Simon joined in too, laughing when grapes hit the floor, but also warning that they needed to be picked up before the dog got to them. Then the horseplay kind of escalated. There was some tickling. There were some light pinches with a pair of cooking tongs. At one point, Sarah nipped Simon on the backside with them, accidentally catching his finger in the process. "Ow," he said, and Scarlett laughed, adding, "Don't be such a wimp, Dad." The comment, thrown in jest, was one of the last things that she would ever say. According to Simon, what happened next happened in just seconds. From the moment that emergency crews stepped into Geneva Road, Simon Vickers began explaining what had just happened, but he never gave exactly the same explanation twice. However, one thing they had in common is each version of events placed distance between his hand and the weapon at the moment of injury. None of his stories matched forensic evidence. Scarlett's mother, Sarah Hall, still with him after 27 years, gave testimony that she believed it was all just an accident. She said they were a happy family, but even her recollections changed under pressure. During the 999 call, she told the operator that they'd been messing about and that her partner threw something and didn't realise. She allegedly told paramedics that they'd been chucking knives. But in court, she said she was in shock and she was not thinking clearly when she made those comments. For the prosecution, the shifting stories were more than confusion. They were signs of a deliberate evasion, of someone shaping their memory in order to avoid the one scenario that the evidence supported, that the implement was in Simon's hand when it entered Scarlett's chest. It was late. The cooking was half done. The football on TV had finished. The wine glasses were on the go. Scarlett had just come down because she was bored, and she wanted to have a laugh. Everyone was messing around together. Because the kitchen was small, everything was within reach. The utensils, the breakfast bar, the cooker. But here is where the stories split off. Simon says that he reached for the tongs. He says he swiped them across the worktop. He says that they clipped the corner. He says that something else must have moved. In another telling, he thought he had the tongs in his hand. In another, it was a sharp kitchen implement that had just been poking out of the side. In yet another story, Scarlett lunged while he was still turning. Sarah then turned back, and she heard her daughter say, "Ow." When she spun around, Scarlett was stood there, stunned, with red already spreading under her pyjama top. It was then that Father Simon grabbed her. He said she started gasping for breath, and that her eyes went like doll's eyes. They say they tried to help her, applying pressure to the wound. The call handler on 999 was counting the beats for CPR, and then the sirens were coming fast, but not fast enough. The room just moments earlier had been a family living in a bubble, a private language of in-jokes and nicknames, the 3 S's. Now it was a murder scene. Now the house was evidence. Simon would later tell police, "I must be responsible." He would say it could only be a freak accident. He would insist there was no sharp implement in any equation, but the cut to Scarlett's top, the path it took between the fabric, the depth inside her chest, all of it would be measured, all of it would be shown, because whatever anyone said they remembered in shock, the physics of it will never forget. Forensic pathologist Dr. Jennifer Bolton examined the injury. Her findings became the spine of the case. Scarlett's injury tracked between 2 ribs. It went through part of the left lung and then into the left ventricle of the heart. It was approximately 11 centimeters in depth, one single entry, no retained blade. To reach that far, Dr. Bolton said, the sharp kitchen implement had to be held, and it had to be held tightly. The father's arm must have braced, a firm grip at the moment of contact. So could a thrown utensil do this? Practically impossible, she told the court. Kitchen tools aren't designed to fly true. They tumble. They strike at bad angles. For something like this free-flying, to pierce the fabric, and then to pierce a chest that deep, it would need to arrive at an almost perfect 90-degree angle. No snagging, no bounce. Straight through a fluffy nightgown layer, through a top, through her bra, and then another 11 centimetres. Even then, the clothing would likely just deflect it, or it would perhaps skate across, leaving a scratch. It would not drive a channel into the chest cavity. A forensic scientist, Gemma Escott, inspected the utensil. Material pattern suggested a direct thrust, not a ricochet, not a glancing strike. Dr. Bolton added that only mild force was needed with a steady hand. This is because, once the point found its path between the ribs, the body would guide it the rest of the way. That is the anatomy and physics of a crime. Time of collapse would have been fast, unconsciousness within just minutes. Paramedics arrived at 22:50, but despite their efforts, Scarlett's time on this earth ended shortly before midnight. The science did not claim to know intent. It did not claim to read minds. But what it could say is how things move and behave, how fabrics resist, how bone channels, how an impact like this is made. And when the court compared those laws of movement to the shifting stories from the kitchen, one version kept failing the test. Teesside Crown Court heard the case over 10 days. On one side, prosecutor Mark McCone Casey, who told the jury that the injury could not have been inflicted accidentally. On the other, defence barrister Nicholas Lumley Casey, who painted Simon as a doting father with no desire or wish to harm her in any way at all. The prosecution leaned heavily on Dr. Bolton's conclusion that the wound was a product of a firm grip and a braced arm. They argued irritation fueled by alcohol that had led to a momentary loss of temper. This had gone beyond horseplay, McCone said. The defence conceded moral responsibility, but not legal guilt. They said Simon was devastated, broken, already serving a life sentence in grief. They pointed to the lack of motive, to the family's closeness, to the total absence of prior violence towards Scarlett. They said, why murder your reason for living? Jurors were reminded they didn't have to know why, only how. After more than 13 hours of deliberation, they returned a majority verdict. 10 for guilty, 2 for not guilty. In the gallery, mother and wife Sarah looked stunned. Simon sat still.
A man has been convicted for the murder of his 14-year-old daughter at Teesside Crown Court. Simon Vickers stabbed his daughter Scarlett in the heart while they were play fighting in the kitchen. He did not visibly react when a jury found him guilty.
Good afternoon. I'm Detective Superintendent Craig Rudd from Durham Constabulary. Scarlett Vickers would have celebrated her 16th birthday this year. She had a whole life ahead of her. Yet it was cruelly cut short by her own father, a man who was meant to protect her. We may never know why or what caused Simon Vickers to do what he did that night. And sadly, today's verdict will not bring Scarlett back, but he will now face the consequences of his actions. I would like to thank my investigation team for their tireless efforts in getting justice for Scarlett, and the community for their cooperation and understanding while we carried out our inquiries. Our thoughts remain with those who cared about Scarlett. Thank you.
On the 10th of February, Simon Vickers stood in the dock as Mr. Justice Cotter delivered his sentencing remarks. Scarlett, the judge said, was a normal, healthy young woman with a long life ahead of her, when it was cut short by you. What had begun as an ordinary Friday night had become a tragedy. And it happened within seconds due to what must have been your loss of temper. The judge told Vickers he had never given a truthful explanation of what happened in that kitchen. The weapon, he said, must have been in your hand before, during and after the event. The wound's depth, 11 centimetres into the heart, was not the result of trifling force. Scarlett's age and the fact she was in her own home were serious aggravating factors. There was no premeditation, the judge accepted this, but it was a momentary, devastating act of anger. For murder, the law prescribed only one sentence, life imprisonment. The father was told he must serve a minimum of 15 years before being considered for release, minus the 217 days already spent on remand. Only he, the judge said, knew precisely what happened in those final moments. Scarlett Vickers should have been planning outfits for her Gran Canaria holiday. She should have been laughing at breakfast with her parents the next morning. Instead, her last conscious sight was the kitchen of the home where she'd grown up, the familiar surroundings, the panic on her parents' faces. Her father will now spend years behind bars. Her mother still stands by him. And the truth about what happened between the grapes, the tongs, and that final moment remains locked inside the one person who has refused to tell it. The why may never be known.
You have been found guilty of the murder of your daughter, Scarlett Vickers, on the 5th of April 2024 in your family home. A normal, healthy young girl with a long life ahead of her when it was cut short by you. She died in the kitchen of her own home within minutes of having been stabbed. It went from an ordinary, happy family Friday night to tragedy within seconds due to what must have been your loss of temper. There is no other plausible explanation. You have never given a truthful explanation of what happened. This was a Friday night. After work, you'd smoked some and drunk some wine. I'm satisfied, given the evidence, you drank more than the 3/4 of a bottle of wine or 4 glasses that you've said you drank. Scarlett came home and was in her bedroom whilst you watched football on the television. You then joined Sarah Hall as she cooked your evening meal. Scarlett came downstairs at about 10:15 to join you in that small kitchen. She and her mother were throwing grapes. You wanted them to stop. Sarah Hall then pinched you on the bottom from behind with some cooking tongs. As you turned, she caught your finger with the tongs and you said, "Ow." Scarlett then said words to the effect of, "Dad, don't be a wimp." Sarah Hall turned her back to resume cooking and heard you say to Scarlett, "How would you like it?" Exactly what then happened, only you know. Scarlett said, "Ow, ow," and Sarah Hall turned to see her standing there injured. There was no in her, because I'm satisfied you'd taken it out as part of the motion. It would not have been possible for Sarah Hall to have missed it unless it was already back on the kitchen surface where you placed it and where it was later noted to be when the paramedics arrived. I have no doubt that you had hold of the knife before, during, and after Scarlett was stabbed. Scarlett died as a result of a single knife wound to the left side of her chest. To stab Scarlett, you must have been close to her. She was also stabbed in part of her chest, normally protected by the arm. After being stabbed, Scarlett stood in the area close to the back door before she collapsed. As Sarah Hall said, the last thing she must have seen was panic on your faces. Simon Vickers, you've given different accounts of what has happened. Specifically, that she was stabbed by accident, that you've been throwing knives, that you'd thrown a spatula or tongs, that Scarlett lunged towards the knife, and that you were swiping tongs along the kitchen surface. Indeed, the unconvincing and wholly implausible version of events you gave to the jury involved you swiping tongs along the kitchen surface before them flying up into the air, and that you'd not even been aware of a knife before or after Scarlett suffered injury. Indeed, you said knife wasn't in any equation except when Sarah Hall had been cutting onions. For the grave offence of murder, there is only one sentence by law that I can pass, and that is imprisonment for life. The clock cannot be turned back. You must now face the consequences that the law dictates. Simon Vickers, for the murder of Scarlett Vickers, I sentence you to life imprisonment. You will serve a minimum term of 15 years, less the 217 days you have served on remand. You may go down.
The knock came just after 3 p.m. Heather Saul opened the door to a man she'd never met before. Stocky, broad-shouldered, but quiet. Inside her small apartment in Charleston, West Virginia, Heather was alone. Her dog Fancy had slipped out earlier. Her friends, who usually stayed nearby for safety, were gone. She was completely on her own. What followed was a frantic battle that would only have one survivor. The man was strong, too strong. One deafening blast rang out, and one person's time on this earth came to an end. Heather Saul didn't want to pick up the phone that day. She'd been working as an escort off and on to support herself and her mom, but lately it had worn thin. She was tired and broke, and trying to figure out what else she could do. I was miserable, she said. If all else failed, I would answer the phone. And that July afternoon in 2015, the number that rang her was unfamiliar. It belonged to a track phone, cheap and disposable. The man on the other end asked if she was available to meet up. He wanted to come over. He asked if she lived alone, and she did. Heather hesitated, but ultimately agreed, and that choice would change everything. Heather had lived in Charleston her whole life. She had worked as a waitress, a head cook. She'd even helped her dad gut houses for HUD repairs. But when she moved into her current apartment, a fast, cheap option in a rougher part of town, things only got harder. The money that she made from escorting helped her to get by, and usually she had someone nearby for safety. And that day, her friends Harley and Lisa were around. But minutes before the man arrived, Lisa ran to the store, and Fancy, Heather's little dog, slipped her leash, so Harley ran after her. So just like that, Heather was alone. When the gold Subaru Forester pulled up, Heather noticed that it wasn't left idling. The driver had cut the engine completely. He knocked, she opened the door, he stepped in and shut it behind him. And then he pressed the cold muzzle of a firearm into her side. He then uttered the words, "Live or die." Heather barely had time to register what was happening before he pounced. He tackled her backwards into the kitchen, hands instantly closing around her throat. "I've fought men my whole life," she later said, "but I knew I wasn't getting out of this unless I fought like hell." The man said nothing else. He just grunted and dragged her across the floor. Heather begged for air. "Please just let me breathe." He growled in return, "You're going to be quiet." His grip was terrifying. Heather would say, "He was clamped down so hard on my throat. I've been through a lot of physical pain, but that was horrible. You could tell by the way he moved, he'd done it before." He threw her around the room like a rag doll. Heather tried to claw at his eyes. He didn't have any teeth, she just remembered seeing gums. He had her pinned down with his chest. Then he barked, "Get up. Don't say nothing else." He was confident and calm, like this was all part of a routine. Heather had one thing to her advantage. She knew her home better than he did. She had one chance to turn this around, a chance that she was about to take. As he dragged her towards the kitchen, Heather's hand brushed something that she'd left by the door. It was a small metal rake that she normally used to clean up after Fancy in the yard. In a desperate moment, she grabbed it. He reacted instantly. He let go of her neck to wrestle it from her grip, and that was his mistake. Just feet away on the kitchen counter sat the firearm that he had laid down just moments before. Heather lunged for it. She grabbed it. She spun around, and without even looking, she pulled the trigger behind her. The shot tore through the mayhem. Heather didn't think the gun was loaded. "I just shot it behind me," she said. It hit him, and just like that, it was over. The man staggered backwards and then dropped to the floor. Heather could hear the fluids pumping from his veins. Now she could breathe again. She bolted out the door, running barefoot down the street. A neighbour saw her and called 911. When police arrived, they found Heather sobbing outside, bruised, battered and shaking.
911, where's your emergency? Did he actually I'm not sure. Was she able to injure him in any way?
Yes, she shot him. She says he's on the kitchen floor, in her kitchen floor.
Oh,
Inside her apartment, laying face down against the door, was a man with one single wound to the head. His time on this earth was called at 3:59 p.m. The man's name was Neil Falls, and what nobody knew in that moment was that Heather had just unknowingly ended a suspected serial predator. Just a few days before that fateful encounter, Neil Falls had walked into a small shop in Bridgeport, West Virginia. This is almost 2 hours from Charleston. He was looking for directions to Pleasant Creek shooting range, the shopkeeper recalled. He was very strange, and I thought it was odd that he had Oregon tags. At the time, the interaction didn't mean much. But after news broke about the shooting in Charleston, the same shopkeeper posted publicly, "This man was in the Bridgeport, West Virginia area last week. He stopped in our shop looking for directions. He was very strange. I called Charleston PD as soon as I saw the local news alert." The man with Oregon plates had only been in town for a week, but already he had unnerved locals, especially escorts. "They deal with a lot of weird people," said Lieutenant Steve Cooper, and they said that this guy really stood out to them. They were frightened off by his behaviour. Those who worked on the street avoided him, so he changed tactics. He bought a track phone and he started searching Backpage at the local library. He copied down the names and numbers of 6 women, 5 in West Virginia, 1 in San Diego, and Heather was the only one who picked up. And now with her attack foiled, detectives wanted to know who was Neil Falls. When police searched his gold Subaru, what they found stopped them cold. Inside the vehicle was what one officer described as a serial killer kit. It wasn't just weapons, it showed terrifying preparation. Detectives retrieved 4 sets of handcuffs from his pockets, a machete, hatchets and multiple sharp implements, a shovel and sledgehammer, bleach, trash bags and cleaning supplies, a bulletproof vest, 5 identical sets of black clothing, a duffel bag and packing tape, and a large Rubbermaid container big enough to hold a human body. Lieutenant Cooper said bluntly, he clearly had plans to store something or carry something away from the apartment. On the back of a computer pass that he had taken from a Kanawha County Public Library, he wrote the first names, ages, and phone numbers of 6 women. According to Assistant Prosecutor Mary Claire Akers, he wasn't there to meet someone, he was there to make someone disappear. In his belongings, there was no cash or credit cards taken from anyone else. There was just tools for abduction, for control, and for disposal. It appears that in this case, Heather stopped that plan from being seen through to the end, and very possibly, she ended a much bigger spree. In the days that followed, Heather didn't sleep. She stayed in the same apartment where all of this had happened, simply because she had nowhere else to go. This was her home. The kitchen was left stained with red. It smelled like a funeral home in here, she said. I had to scrub it myself. They didn't even clean it up. People kept on knocking on her door. The media, strangers, even the police claiming that they wanted to help. However, Heather was left not being able to trust anyone. I don't want to hermit myself in here, but I'm scared. Some days I can't even go out in public. I start panicking real bad. I just stop breathing and my chest hurts. She was trying to move forward, but everywhere that she turned, other people wanted to control her story. What no one seemed to understand at the time was this. Heather didn't want to be famous. She simply just survived. When detectives later asked Heather what Neil Falls had said to her on that day, her answer was instant. He said, I'm going to prison for a long time, and it's your choice whether it's for rape or murder. This didn't sound like a threat, it sounded like a guarantee, and it was then that he lunged. Heather said he was squeezing so tight, I didn't think I was going to live through it. She begged him, pleaded, please, please just let me get a breath. But he didn't. He dragged her across the floor, told her to get up and be quiet. Heather said later, he was calm, like he knew exactly what he was doing. He had done this before. and it was simply due to one mistake, setting the weapon down. This was the only reason that Heather lived. I don't want to kill no one, Heather told investigators. I didn't mean to kill him, but I just knew he was going to kill me. But one thing we don't really know yet is, who was Neil Falls? Neil Martin Falls was born on September 24th, 1969 in Eugene, Oregon. He was one of 10 siblings in a violent and impoverished household. A family friend would later recall, his father used to beat his mother in front of the kids. It was bad. As a teenager, Falls developed an obsession with firearms, with survival gear, and with general military paraphernalia. He never drank nor did he use illicit substances. He kept his nose clean on paper. In his 20s, he bounced between states, Greensburg, Kansas, where he lived with his father until his passing, and then back to Oregon, where he became a private security guard. By 2000, he was in Nevada, working security at the Hoover Dam. And it seems his co-workers there were uneasy about him. He delighted in torturing desert rats, one said. He gave people the creeps. Another said, we actually joked. He was out dumping bodies.
He had told a co-worker that he had trained a deer to come closer and closer to him, and to the point where the deer would actually come and eat from his hand. And at one point, he accomplished his final mission with this deer, and that was to stab the deer in the throat while it ate out of his hand.
In 2008, a harassment complaint got him fired. From there, he spiraled. He began moving constantly, Oregon, Indiana, Kentucky, Texas, often alone and often jobless. When his mother passed in early 2015, and he found out a woman he'd been seeing was actually married, it seems that he snapped. He kind of disappeared, said his sister Joanna. He stopped talking to the family. But what no one knew at the time was that Neil Falls wasn't just wandering aimlessly, he was planning, and wherever he went, women went missing.
Well, Neil Falls, he lived a double life. He worked to protect people as a security guard in Oregon, but police think he was also a serial killer with potential victims across the country. Tonight we hear how the woman he was about to make his next victim turned the tables on him.
I opened the door, he put the gun in my chest, and he said, live or die. That's the first thing he said.
For the first time, we can show you this police interrogation video as Heather Saul describes how she killed Neil Falls.
Sorry that I killed him. I didn't mean to kill him. I didn't want to kill no one. And I seen the gun, I grabbed it out and went like this and popped.
Heather had never met Falls before when she met him online and agreed to meet at her apartment in Charleston, West Virginia in mid-July.
He said, I'm going to prison for a long time, and it's your choice whether it's for rape or murder.
Falls tried choking Heather. She grabbed a rake, and that's when Falls made his fatal mistake. He put the gun down and grabbed the rake, and then
I went like that and just shot.
Much of Neil Falls' 45 years of life is a mystery. I found his high school yearbook photo when he spent his freshman year in Klamath Falls, where he struggled in school. His former landlord in Eugene showed his renter's application, where Falls wrote he worked for a security company assigned to the Hilton Hotel. Public records show he lived in Coos Bay, Albany, and Lebanon.
State of Oregon on a Subaru.
This is body camera video from a policeman in Texas who pulled Falls over just 11 days before he died. You can only see his face briefly.
You still at the same address here in Oregon?
Nope. I'm actually don't know where I'm headed or where I'm going right now.
Where at now?
I don't know where my next stop is.
Okay, you just living out of your vehicle?
Until I get to West Virginia.
We've also obtained police photos of the crime scene in West Virginia and the victim. Some are too graphic to show. But we can show you items thrown all around and the shell of the bullet that would ultimately kill Neil Falls. Outside in Falls' car with Oregon license plates, police found it filled with things you'd only see in a horror movie. We've obtained video of what police call a serial killer kit.
Mr. Falls had firearm, handcuffs. He had the ability to kill, maim, and disable and keep prisoner, if necessary,
any victim that he had ran across. So with the machete, the cutting instruments, large cache of trash bags and bleach, and plus he had a tub that you would fit in. There was a large tub in his vehicle with a lid on it that most women could fit into.
Investigators say they believe Heather wasn't the only one Falls tried to kill on his trip from Oregon to West Virginia. He's a suspect in Nevada, where several escorts were dismembered. Falls is possibly linked to other murders, including 2 in Texas. Investigators believe Falls' work may go back years and be connected to dozens of other women's murders in as many as 9 states.
I'm sorry, I didn't.
After Heather ended Falls, the FBI stepped in. They wanted to know where he'd been and who might have vanished along the way. And what they found was horrifying. Between 2003 and 2007, whilst he lived in Henderson, Nevada, multiple escorts vanished. 3 were later found dismembered in Nevada, California, and Illinois. The women were Misty Sains, 25, who disappeared from Las Vegas. Her torso was found wrapped in plastic near Red Rock Canyon. Jody Brewer, 19, also found dismembered near I-15 in California. Witnesses say that she got into a white car with out-of-state plates. And Lindsay Harris, 21, who vanished from Henderson. 3 weeks later, her legs were found in a field outside Springfield, Illinois. And then came Ohio. In 2013 and 2014, at least 6 women went missing in and around Chillicothe. Among them, Megan Lancaster, Holly Renee Logan, Jamie Bowen, Charlotte Trago, Tamika Lynch, and Tiffany Sayer. Most of these were known to be escorts. Some of them were found in rivers or wrapped in sheets, and all of them vanished before Neil Falls arrived in West Virginia. And after Heather ended his time on this earth, these disappearances within close proximity to Neil Falls just stopped. Lieutenant Steve Cooper later said, "We believe there's a lot of guys doing the same kind of thing out there, but Neil Falls, he got this far before anyone ever saw it. Because Heather fought back, his reign of terror stopped, and because she lived, others may live too." It was an ordinary morning in Oberon, Australia. A man opened the safe like he had done 100 times before. It seemed like quite a routine event, just the quiet clink of metal and the silent weight of a decision he'd already made bearing down onto him. Outside though, the world just carried on. Coffee brewed in kitchens. Families got ready for their days. The birds sang away in the trees. But inside this house, an invisible line had already been crossed, and it happened long before anyone even knew they were in danger. As the man looked down at the object in his hands, he said, "That's the one that's going to put him to sleep." Damian Conland was known as Mad Dog, but this wasn't for the reasons that you might think. It wasn't because he was wild or reckless. Instead, it was because he was the kind of man who brought life into a room. He was a big personality, a practical joker, someone who gave just as good as he got, but someone that always had your back. He was our family's best friend, his brother John said. He was the sort of fella you'd ring at midnight and say, "My shower's broken," and he'd jump out of bed, put his boots on, and come over to help. Originally from Summerhill Village in Sligo, Ireland, Damian had moved to Australia in 2011, riding out the Irish recession with just a carpenter's toolkit and a vision. He met Linda Simon in 2019 on a dating app. By the second date, she knew. It was love at first sight, she later said. "We just clicked. I knew he was the one." Damian rang his mother every single day from Australia. He told his brother John that moving down under had been his dream, and that now he'd finally found his place. And by February of 2023, Damian and Linda had already paid deposits for their wedding venue and church. They were now just months away from the Isle. When Damian originally arrived in Australia, he was on a 1-year working holiday visa. He was just a young man with a trade and a dream, but Australia became his place. Damian had a dream and he followed it, his brother John said, and we are all proud of how he made it come true. Damian didn't just build things for other people, he built a life, a business and a family. By 2021, he was a dual citizen. This photo of Damian smiling in front of the Australian flag would later be shown at his funeral, proof of a life well lived and well earned through grit and love. He and Linda had moved in together not too long after they met, and Damian stepped into the role of father for her 2 boys. He quickly became the hands-on dad that every kid dreams of, and together they built a blended family of 6. They had 2 children of their own, Mason and Elias, as well as 2 more from Linda's previous relationship named Brody and Joseph. Damian doted on all 4 of our kids, Linda said. He loved showing them woodwork. He was an avid motorbike fan. He was always laughing. The couple were planning to marry in November of 2023. We had deposits paid on the venue, the church, everything, Linda said. But that will never be. She called Damian her soulmate. And he wasn't just her partner, he was her anchor. I feel a tremendous amount of survivor's guilt for not being there with Damian, she would later tell a court. She was still wearing her engagement ring when she gave her victim impact statement. From the outside, it might have looked like a perfect blended family all getting along, but behind closed doors, the relationship between Damian and Linda's father, a man named Luke Simon, was crumbling. Luke was a military man. He was an army veteran now in his 60s. He was proud, strict, and fiercely territorial. In 2021, he inherited a property in Oberon. This property had been in Luke Simon's family for generations, and after his father's passing in 2021, the inherited property consisted of a home and also land. The property was a modest setup, but to Luke it symbolized legacy, and to him this whole thing was about control and pride. Linda and Damian proposed building a granny flat for Luke, allowing them to live in the main house with their growing family. And this is something that Luke agreed to. As a man entering his older years, this seemed like the perfect setup. On paper, it all made sense. But emotionally, Luke was losing grip, and something shifted. When Linda and Damian eventually served him with paperwork, where they requested that he vacate the entire premises for renovations, this made Luke see red. He believed he wasn't just being asked to move out temporarily. He thought he was being ousted. He thought his history, his legacy was being erased. In his own words, they wanted to take everything. My house, my name, my family. And that's when the threats began. He accused Damian of being manipulative, of working some kind of long con. Luke believed he was doing him over. Privately, the man seethed. He began accusing the couple of trying to take the property from him. He believed he was being pushed off the very same land that his father had spent an entire lifetime building up. And according to Linda, her father was becoming paranoid. He was becoming hostile and volatile. She says that Luke stopped seeing Damian as family at all. To him, he was now the enemy inside the gates. When Luke was served a document asking him to vacate the premises so that the renovation could begin, that switch flipped and it couldn't be turned off. 60 years of hard work by my old man, he told a neighbour, and they just wanted to take it. February the 7th, 2023. CCTV inside Luke Simon's laundry room captures him unlocking a gun safe. He lifts out a weapon in a case. He acts with the same calmness, as if he were doing something normal like getting a jar out of a cupboard. He then mutters, "That's the one that is going to put him to sleep." This is all available CCTV footage from that moment.
There you are, you little lamb. I was going to put you to sleep. Ta-da. See you later. Thank you. You're going. You're going.
Meanwhile, at the local IGA store, Luke tells a deli worker, "Someone's been ripping me off. I'll get them. And by this stage, the act wasn't just planned, it was well rehearsed. His lawyer would later argue that Luke hadn't in fact taken a weapon out of the safe at all, that it was just an empty case. And we'll see later whether the judge believed that. So far, we've been piecing everything together, but let's get down to the crux of this story. On the morning of February the 9th, Luke sent a text message to Damian, where he said something had been stolen from the house, and Damian, always a fixer, always ready to help, came over without hesitation. He arrived just before 8 a.m. The CCTV footage shows it clearly. He steps out of the car, he takes off his sunglasses, and he follows Luke towards the house. CCTV then shows Damian walking inside.
Been known to have a quick look first, mate. See what...
I'm not sure. I'm not looking at them. I'm not sure what's happened. I'm not 100% sure.
There's no argument captured on film, but what happened inside the front door would shatter the lives of 4 children and an entire family forever. Luke pointed the weapon at Damian and he ordered him to get on your knees and confess. Damian may have thought this was some bizarre bluff or a heated outburst, maybe even a dark joke, but it wasn't. At 7:56 a.m, Damian was now lying on the ground outside the house, with Luke stood over him. Luke claims, "I said to him, say your prayers. Bye-bye, Damian. He smiled at me, so I pulled the gun." 1 round went through his body. Damian somehow crawled or stumbled out towards the garden, but it was already too late. And then 1 more blast struck him behind the ear. Luke then sat calmly on a trailer in the driveway and waited for police. "I'm unarmed," he told the operator. "I've just killed my son-in-law, my daughter's boyfriend, you might say." He also confessed to a neighbour that passed by, saying, "I just killed Damian. I've called the cops. Don't worry, mate, you're in no danger." He also said, "I lured him here. He confessed. I shot him." Luke seemed to show no signs of remorse, just a strange sense of justification. He told police that none of this was premeditated, that it was simply the smirk on Damian's face that set him off. But would those in court feel the same way? When Linda Simon stood in court, she didn't just speak as a grieving fiancée. She spoke as a mother, as a daughter, and as someone who just watched the man who raised her now become a killer. "Luke, I believe you are a coward," she said whilst locking eyes with the father who destroyed her family. "You couldn't face Damian like a man and have a conversation with him like a human being." Her voice broke as she told the court how she still replays Damian's final moments in her head, about the guilt she feels that she wasn't there to stop it, about how their children ask her where their daddy has gone and why. Damian died alone, cold and scared. I'll replay these tragic events for the rest of my life. Linda also said she felt a tremendous amount of survivor's guilt, that she and Damian were just weeks away from their wedding, that they'd chosen the venue, booked the church, and planned to have all 4 boys standing with them. "You only had one intention when you lured him into your home," she told her father, and that was that Damian would not be alive after he entered your house. She said that her father's actions weren't just violent, that they were cold, calculated, and deliberate, and that worst of all, even worse than the heartache for herself, they had robbed her sons of their dad. He would have given them so much, and now they will never know that love, she said. In the weeks after Damian's death, Linda's home was full of silence. Her sons, especially the youngest, kept asking the same question. Why is Daddy dead? There's no answer that makes sense to a toddler. No way to explain that a man who should have been part of their protection had instead taken away their hero. Luke Simon's crime has made it so they will never have that opportunity to feel that connection, that love and support from their father, Linda told the court. He would have given them that and so much more. She spoke about the milestones her boys would now face alone, their first days at school, their birthdays, their weddings, and every Father's Day, all gone. Damian's parents, Dermot and Ethel, still lived back in Sligo in Ireland. They were obviously devastated by the loss of their youngest son. Damian rang our mum every single day, his brother John said. She still listens for the phone. To make things even worse, Damian's body was in such a severe state from the attack, there was no chance for his family to say goodbye properly. And in fact, there would be no physical goodbye at all, just ashes in a box. Luke robbed us of that too, Linda said. There was no chance to hold him one last time. The family did eventually get Damian home to Ireland, but it wasn't the way that anyone had imagined.
Chilling footage has emerged of an army veteran pulling out what appears to be a gun days before shooting his soon-to-be son-in-law dead at an Oberon property. Today, the 60-year-old was sentenced for murder as the court heard more details about his possible motive.
In May of 2025, Luke Simon was sentenced to 31 years in prison for the murder of Damian Conland. He will serve a minimum of 22 years before he is eligible for parole. Justice Sarah McNaughton called it a calculated and premeditated act of violence, one that was made even more chilling by Luke's calm demeanour. She acknowledged Linda's plea that the children Damian left behind now deserve peace, that his killer may never walk freely again, and chances are he never will. He pinned his partner to the floor, then he came back with the can. The man, already partially blind, was still catching his breath when Liam Corcoran pressed the cap and sprayed hairspray straight into his eyes. But he didn't stop there. Furious strikes rained down on his partner as he struggled beneath him. The man would describe their 4-year relationship as like walking on eggshells. Sometimes he would be kind, sometimes he would be cruel, but he would always be unpredictable. I guarantee that you will never guess the trajectory of this story in a million years. So buckle up, because the fasten seatbelt light is on. It was the middle of the summer holidays in 2012. An 11-year-old Liam Corcoran was out shopping with his mum. They were at the Wythenshawe Civic Centre. This is a place just 3 miles from Manchester Airport. The two of them had an argument, and although it may have started over something small, Liam was opinionated and energetic, so what started as a simple disagreement at the swimming pool now spiralled into something much bigger. Liam had slipped away before, but never like this. This time, Mother Mary turned her back, and Liam was just gone. She searched the centre and alerted security. Staff checked the exits, but there was still no sign of Liam. Mary contacted the police and reported her son missing. It would be more than 4 hours before she got a call back, but it wasn't from a local officer. In fact, this person wasn't even in the country. It was from a man over 1,000 miles away. But how on earth had this 11-year-old boy gotten so far and so quickly? This sounds like it could be a case of human trafficking. The man on the other end of the phone told Mary they had her boy, and he was now in Rome. But none of this made any sense, and honestly the story of what happened to Liam is pretty mind-blowing. I don't think I've ever heard of another case like this. Liam's journey to Italy wasn't part of some master plan. In his own words, he just wanted to go to the toilet. After leaving the shopping centre and his mother, he boarded a public bus heading towards Manchester Airport. But he was just 11 years old, so he didn't have any money, nor did he have a real plan. In fact, he didn't even have proper shoes fit for running away. He just had flip-flops, a Spider-Man t-shirt, and a strange and possibly admirable sense of confidence to go it alone. At Terminal 1, Liam did something that, in hindsight, feels almost impossible. He just walked in, and then he kept on walking. Remember, this is in a post-9/11 world, so how on earth did he manage any of this? Security footage later revealed the sequence of events once inside. He joined a group of passengers, including a family, heading towards a lift. Nobody asked him who he was. He passed through the metal detector with no ID, no bags, and no questions asked. I presume that everyone thought that he didn't have bags, because he must be with his parents and his parents must have them. But I guess we'll never know. He was scanned, and his palms were checked for traces of explosives. The staff even smiled at him as he passed through. From there, he found a corridor and then ducked under a barrier. Liam then tailgated behind another family, blending in with parents and kids in the chaos of the summer travel. Nobody stopped him at the gate. He'd made it all the way through the airport. Somehow, Jet2 staff failed to notice that this child had no passport, no boarding card, no tickets, and no adult companion. He simply walked up to the first gate that was boarding. It was flight LS791, and it was bound for Rome. This child simply walked straight onto the plane and sat down. Liam didn't know it, but he just evaded 5 separate layers of airport security. No passport check, no boarding pass scan, no airline head count, no ID confirmation, and not a single adult questioning this child's lone presence. Reminder, he was just 11 years old, and somehow he was now seated on a plane to Italy. But when the doors closed and the aircraft began to taxi, that's when it really all caught up. Liam later said that he'd gone into the plane's toilet and then accidentally locked himself in. He says that he tried the handle, but it just wouldn't open. And then, whoosh, he was airborne. By the time he got out of the restroom and found a seat, the plane was already over France. The cabin crew still hadn't realised that they had let an unaccompanied minor on board the plane. In fact, it wasn't until Liam began talking to nearby passengers, telling them proudly that he'd run away from home, that someone realised that something was actually very, very wrong. A concerned passenger spoke to a flight attendant, and that's when it all started to unravel. The pilot radioed back to Manchester, and air traffic control contacted the local police. And then finally, someone picked up the phone and called Mother Mary. "Your son is safe," they said, "but he's in Rome." Mary thought it was a scam, and I really can't blame her. Her vulnerable, allegedly learning disabled 11-year-old was now in Rome. That sounds impossible, but somehow it was real. And as she tried to wrap her head around it all, officials in both countries scrambled to figure out what to do next. By the time flight LS791 touched down near Rome, the Italian authorities were already waiting. Liam didn't even get to leave the aircraft. He remained on board under the supervision of cabin crew, whilst police and immigration processed the rest of the passengers. He spent nearly 2 hours at the airport with airline staff and Italian officers. They offered him food and drinks. He says he picked up a few Italian words, but mostly the little boy that had run away just wanted to go home. "I didn't like it in Rome," he later said. "It was too big, too scary. I just wanted to see my mum." By now, the story had already hit British media. The boy who flew to Rome alone without documents had made a mockery of UK border security, and all of this just days before the London Olympics.
Liam Corcoran flew Jet 2 to Rome yesterday afternoon, and nobody knew he was there. Which is surprising, given that Liam is 11 years old and had no money, no passport and no ticket.
We're certainly not proud of what's happened, and that's why we and the airline are doing an investigation. Now, if you think about what's security like at this time of year, there's lots of families travelling on holiday. 11-year-old boy turns up, he's very confident, he's mingled with other families, presented himself to security. At that point, we should have realised he didn't have a boarding card.
What he did have was a knack for evading detection, wandering off from his mum while they were out shopping, and then somehow navigating the 3 miles from Wythenshawe shops to Manchester Airport. Now only the meticulous security checks of an Olympic host nation stood between him and Italy.
Jet 2 rushed to explain the failure. 5 staff members were suspended. The airline reinstated onboard head counts, and Liam, he boarded the return flight that same evening. When the plane landed back in Manchester at around 10:30 p.m, he was escorted off first. His mother was ready and waiting on the tarmac. She burst into tears when she saw him. In the days that followed, Liam Corcoran became a strange sort of celebrity. Newspapers called him Rome Alone, a real-life take on Home Alone but with a weird British twist. TV interviews followed. Photos of him in a Spider-Man t-shirt were everywhere. He was smiling, he was relaxed, and he was now telling reporters that getting on the plane had been easier than doing my homework. But behind the headlines was a very different picture. Liam was not like most 11-year-olds. His parents were separated. He had documented learning difficulties. His mother described him as trusting but vulnerable, and he was known to run away when he got overwhelmed. He'd never even been abroad before that day. Officials quietly noted that something had gone badly wrong, not just with airport protocol, but in how easily a child with complex needs could disappear for nearly an entire day. An investigation into Manchester airport system was launched.
He's walked up to security. Now, it's very busy, it's the school holidays. He's mingled with a family, or several families actually, and it appears from the CCTV footage it looks like he's part of that party. When you approach security, of course, security is looking principally for any threats, and he's gone through a security process. The thing that's led us down is he hasn't had a boarding card at that point, and that's been missed. We are now investigating that and taking that extremely seriously.
Yeah, I mean, apart from the boarding card, there are other opportunities, aren't there, to check ID? I mean, the passport check, for instance. Presumably there were a number of points, including the points at which he got on the plane, where
Absolutely.
he simply wasn't checked.
Security is the first point where you check whether somebody is supposed to be in the area, and clearly he wasn't. Now, once he went straight from security, at no point is he distressed. It's a bit of an adventure for him, obviously. He heads straight to the nearest aircraft that's boarding, which happens to be this Jet 2 flight to Rome. At that point, there should be checks for, does he have a boarding card, does he have a passport that matches the boarding card, does he have a seat, and ultimately the head count on board. All of those checks didn't pick him up. That is also subject to the same major investigation, and it's that element where staff have been suspended.
How was it discovered that he was not where he should be? Who finally found out that he was in the wrong place?
Well, we understand from the airline that he was obviously very excitable. He's seen this as a bit of an adventure, and he has been returned safely to his parents. Obviously, we see it very differently, and it's been taken extremely seriously, but he's talking about the experience on board the aircraft. Passengers have heard him, they've reported him to the crew, so by the time the flight landed in Rome, the authorities knew to expect him, and he was given a sympathetic and tasteful welcome, and then brought home. He was reunited with his parents last night.
One spokesperson insisted that, although the breach was serious, Liam had gone through full security screening, and he posed no threat to others. But that really wasn't the point. His mother Mary said it best. How did he get that far without anyone asking him one question? And this was a question that no one could fully answer. Once the news cycles moved on, once the novelty of a child on a plane wore off, so did the public's attention. But Liam didn't just go away. Instead, he grew up quietly out of the spotlight. Until that is 2024, when he made headlines once again, only this time there were no smiles, nobody was joking, there was no Spider-Man t-shirts and flip-flops, just a court summons, and a man describing what it felt like to be pinned to the floor and sprayed in the eyes by his former partner. It happened in Manchester just after a night out. Liam, now 23 years old, had been in a relationship with his partner for 4 years, a man who was partially blind, a man who said that he spent most days walking on eggshells. On the night in question, Liam accused his partner of ruining the evening. It started with a blow to the face outside a takeaway. This caused minimal injuries, but it's still not something to just be ignored. And as well as that physicality, there was also a shouting match, but the disagreement nor the violence ended there. Days later, another disagreement flared up at home. Liam began shouting at their dogs, at which point the victim intervened. Liam then rugby tackled him to the ground and began pounding him with punches. The victim tried to kick free, landing a defensive blow to Liam's face, but Liam would not back down. Instead, he left the room, and when he returned, he was now holding a can of hairspray. He pinned his partner to the bed, and he sprayed him directly into his eye. He was targeting a vulnerability that he knew existed. This was a very personal and premeditated act, an act that the judge would later describe as absolutely atrocious. The next day, the victim found messages on Liam's phone, conversations between Liam and his mother, Mary. In them, Liam admitted to something else. He said he'd used an electric razor to injure his partner during the attack. Police were called, Liam was arrested, and during police interviews, he admitted to both attacks. He claimed that he was mentally unstable at the time, and he then apologised. And in court, he pleaded guilty to 2 charges: assault by beating and assault occasioning actual bodily harm. Liam had no prior convictions, but the magistrate didn't hold back. "Let me tell you," the presiding JP said, "some of the things you have done during these episodes have been absolutely atrocious. You need to get your life together, young man. You can't be doing this sort of thing. It's a disgrace. You could have permanently blinded him." Liam Corcoran was sentenced to an 18-month community order, and with that he was required to complete 20 days of rehabilitation activity, 200 hours of unpaid work, and £199 in court costs that would be deducted from his benefits. His defence described him as someone in need of support. They said that there were 2 sides to every story, that he had now moved on with a new partner, and he now had a settled address. But for the man left behind, the one he attacked in the most targeted and personal way, those years with Liam still cast a shadow. In a statement, the victim said, "I felt abused financially, physically, and mentally over the years. This is the most honest I've been able to be in the last 5 years. I was so afraid." He later retracted the statement. He said that he was worried about Liam's well-being, and just like that, the boy who once stunned the world by flying across Europe without a passport had quietly become just another name in the court system, another case file in Manchester, and let's hope that case file doesn't get any bigger. It was May 1999 when a 14-year-old girl walked into a police station in Hong Kong and told officers something they had never heard before. For weeks, she said, she had been haunted by a woman. The woman appeared in her dreams almost every night. According to the girl, she had suffered terribly inside an apartment in Kowloon before ultimately meeting her end there. The teenager claimed she could still see her face, she could still hear her voice, and she could no longer live with what she knew. At first, the officers were skeptical. Hong Kong police were accustomed to dealing with criminals, disputes, and emergencies. Ghost stories were another matter entirely. The girl was visibly distressed, but there was little reason to believe her account was anything more than nightmares or the imagination of a troubled child. Then she revealed one detail that changed everything. She claimed that she actually knew the woman. More importantly, she claimed she had been inside the apartment where the woman had passed. Suddenly, the conversation became very real. Police followed the teenager through the crowded streets of Kowloon to an apartment on Granville Road. What they found inside would trigger one of the most infamous criminal investigations in Hong Kong's history. The case would shock a city known for having one of the lowest homicide rates in the world. It would expose a hidden world of organized crime, substance misuse, exploitation, and violence that many residents rarely saw. And at the center of it all was a 23-year-old mother named Fan Man Yi. Long before her name appeared in newspapers across Hong Kong, Fan had already lived through circumstances that would have been difficult for almost anyone to overcome. Born in Shenzhen in 1976, she was abandoned by her family while still a child. Rather than growing up in a stable home, she was raised in an all-girls orphanage in Ma Tau Wai. The orphanage provided shelter and structure, but it could not provide a permanent future. When Fan reached the age of 15, she was required to leave because she had exceeded the institution's age limit. Like many young people leaving institutional care, she entered adulthood with very little support. The years that followed were plagued by instability. Fan became homeless and developed a substance addiction. Without reliable income or family support, She eventually entered street escorting before later finding work at a brothel called Romance Villa in Sham Shui Po. It was a life shaped largely by survival rather than opportunity. During this period, she met Ng Chi Yuen, one of her clients. The relationship eventually led to marriage, and in November 1998, she gave birth to a son. By all accounts, becoming a mother represented a major turning point in her life. For the first time in years, there was a clear reason to try to build something more stable. According to reports, Phan began making significant changes. She stopped using substances, left escorting, and secured work as a hostess at Empress Karaoke Club. She also left her husband, whose behavior had reportedly caused repeated disturbances that neighbors could hear from nearby apartments. These were not small decisions. They represented an attempt to break away from the circumstances that had defined much of her adult life. However, rebuilding a life is rarely straightforward. Although she had left behind many of the environments that had contributed to her problems, she was now supporting a young child with far less income than she had previously been earning. Financial pressure remained constant. Every decision carried consequences. Every setback was harder to absorb. When investigators later examined the events leading up to her disappearance, this period became important context. Phan was not living a settled and secure life. She was still trying to create one. She was attempting to distance herself from addiction, instability, and dangerous relationships, while supporting her son at the same time. Unfortunately, not everyone from her past had disappeared. One of those people was a man named Chan Man Lok. By early 1999, Phan's life remained fragile, despite the progress she had made. She was no longer living exactly as she had before, but the financial pressures that had shaped much of her adult life had not disappeared. Supporting herself and her young son was difficult, and many of the people she had known through the nightlife industry still existed on the edges of her world. One of those people was Chan Man Lok. Chan was not simply a former customer. He was a member of the Wo Shing Wo triad and already had a criminal history that included a conviction for illicit substance trafficking. He moved comfortably within Hong Kong's criminal underworld and surrounded himself with younger associates who looked to him for leadership. By the late 1990s, he was well known by a lot of bad people. At some point in early 1999, Phan stole Chan's wallet. Reports indicate that it contained approximately 4,000 Hong Kong dollars. When Chan realized what had happened, he confronted her. Phan returned the stolen money, which under ordinary circumstances might have brought the matter to an end. Instead, Chan demanded more. According to multiple accounts, he insisted that Phan pay an additional 10,000 Hong Kong dollars on top of the money she had already returned. For someone already struggling financially, it was a significant amount. Phan did not have the resources to pay it immediately, and the dispute remained unresolved. The money was worth about $1,200. Looking back, the amount itself almost feels insignificant compared to what followed. Yet investigators would later identify this disagreement as the event that set everything else in motion. Around Chan was a small group of associates, including Leung Xing Cho and Leung Wai Lun. Also present was a 14-year-old girl named Lau Ming Fong, commonly known as Ah Fong. Her presence would later become one of the most unusual and troubling aspects of the entire case. Although still a child, she had become involved with older criminals and was spending time in environments where substances, organized crime and exploitation were common. On March 17, 1999, the situation escalated dramatically. Chan, Xingcho, Wai Lun, and Ah Fong abducted Phan from her residence in Lai Yu Estate. She was then transported to an apartment at 31 Granville Road in Sim Sha Tsui. The location itself was unremarkable. Granville Road sat within one of Hong Kong's busiest districts. Every day, thousands of people walked through the area on their way to work, restaurants, hotels, and shops. It was the kind of place where people lived close together and rarely imagined that something extraordinary could be happening behind an ordinary apartment door. Yet while life continued normally outside, Phan effectively disappeared from public view. What followed would become the central focus of one of Hong Kong's most infamous criminal trials. For more than a month, Fan was lost to the world. No major police operation was searching the building. No public appeal had connected Fan's disappearance to the apartment. The people involved had successfully concealed what had happened, and for a time, appeared to believe that the truth would never emerge. In May 1999, Ah Fong approached police and began describing a woman who had passed inside an apartment in Sim Sha Tsui. Different reports would later offer different explanations for why she came forward. Some focused on feelings of guilt. Others reported that she had been experiencing recurring nightmares and had become convinced that she was being haunted by the victim. Whatever her motivation, the significance of her actions cannot be overstated. Police suddenly had something they had never possessed before, a witness with direct knowledge of the apartment. Ah Fong did more than simply describe events. She led investigators directly to the location. Once officers entered the apartment, their doubts quickly disappeared. The search uncovered human remains and evidence that supported key parts of Ah Fong's account. Most notably, investigators discovered a skull concealed inside a Hello Kitty mermaid plush toy. Additional remains were recovered from the apartment, while further remains were later located at disposal sites elsewhere in Hong Kong. The discovery transformed the investigation overnight. Police were no longer trying to determine whether a crime had occurred. They now faced the task of reconstructing a month-long sequence of events involving multiple suspects, limited forensic evidence, and a witness whose own involvement would become a major issue in the case. The unusual concealment of the skull attracted immediate media attention. News organizations quickly began referring to the investigation as the Hello Kitty murder case. The name spread rapidly through Hong Kong and eventually around the world. The contrast between a globally recognized children's character and the evidence recovered by investigators created a level of public fascination rarely seen in criminal cases. Meanwhile, investigators focused on identifying the victim and locating everyone connected to the apartment. Chan Man Lok and Xing Cho were both arrested. Wai Lun fled to mainland China but was later apprehended and returned to Hong Kong. Investigators also examined whether additional individuals had been involved. Chan's wife was questioned during the investigation, but was released after no evidence linked her to the crime. On June 3, 1999, forensic specialists formally identified the recovered skull as belonging to Fan Man Yi. The unidentified victim now had a name. This woman, this mother, had now been recovered. The suspects were in custody. The investigation was complete enough to move toward prosecution, yet one major problem remained unresolved, and it would soon become the central issue in court. The apartment at 31 Granville Road would eventually become one of the most heavily scrutinized crime scenes in Hong Kong's modern history. Yet even after investigators gained access to it, reconstructing exactly what had happened inside proved remarkably difficult. Unlike many investigations, police could not rely solely on forensic evidence. Much of what occurred inside the apartment had to be pieced together through witness statements, testimony, and the accounts of the people who had been present. As a result, investigators were often forced to build a timeline from fragments rather than from a complete record of events. What is known is that Fan remained captive in the apartment for approximately a month. During that time, there were repeated assaults and ongoing maltreatment. Witnesses described a situation that continued over an extended period, rather than a single outburst of violence. The evidence suggested that Fan's captivity became a routine part of life inside the apartment. Investigators also learned that illicit stimulant use was common among members of the group. This became an important piece of context because it helped explain the environment they were dealing with. Experts later noted that prolonged methamphetamine use can contribute to paranoia, aggression, impaired judgment, and increasingly erratic behavior. However, investigators never viewed substance use as a complete explanation for what had happened. The duration of the captivity suggested a level of control and organization that extended far beyond a temporary loss of judgment. Fan remained isolated from the outside world, while the group maintained authority over every aspect of her environment. Days turned into weeks, and according to testimony, the situation continued without intervention from anyone outside the apartment. One of the most important figures in understanding this period was Ah Fong. Years later, public attention would focus heavily on the fact that she eventually approached police. Before that happened, however, she had been inside the apartment and had witnessed parts of what occurred there. Her knowledge would become crucial because investigators possessed very little direct evidence capable of explaining the day-to-day reality of the captivity. This created a difficult problem for prosecutors. Without Ah Fong's testimony, investigators would have struggled to understand what had happened inside the apartment. At the same time, her own statements placed her at the scene during portions of the ordeal. She was not simply an observer who learned about events afterwards. She was present while events were unfolding. Authorities ultimately decided that obtaining her testimony was essential. In exchange for immunity, she agreed to provide information about what had taken place. The arrangement was controversial and remains debated today, but from an investigative perspective, it gave prosecutors access to the witness who knew the most about life inside the apartment. As the weeks passed, Phan's physical condition appears to have deteriorated. The exact sequence of events remains unclear because the available evidence could not establish a complete timeline. Different accounts sometimes conflicted with one another, and forensic limitations prevented investigators from filling every gap. Then, sometime between April 14th and April 15th, 1999, Phan's time on this earth came to an end. The precise cause of her passing would later become one of the most important questions in the entire case. Prosecutors argued that the prolonged maltreatment was responsible. The defense maintained that an overdose could not be ruled out. Ordinarily, forensic examination might have resolved the dispute. In this case, however, investigators were about to discover that determining exactly how Phan met her end would be far more difficult than determining who had been responsible for her captivity. That single uncertainty would ultimately shape the outcome of the trial itself. The trial began in October 2000 and lasted approximately 6 weeks. By this stage, investigators had assembled witness testimony, physical evidence, forensic findings, and detailed accounts of what had occurred inside the Granville Road apartment. From a public perspective, many people assumed that convictions for murder were inevitable. The evidence of prolonged attacks appeared overwhelming, and public interest in the case was intense. The reality proved far more complicated. The central issue was not whether Phan had suffered during her captivity. Testimony and evidence established that clearly. The problem was determining the exact cause of her end. Because of the condition of the recovered remains, forensic specialists could not provide a definitive answer. And, by the way, when I say there wasn't much evidence left, I mean that most of Phan had been disposed of. The perpetrators dismantled the body and then spent hours boiling down the remains to dispose of her more easily. So all that was left at the time of discovery was a skull, a tooth, and some organs, all of which had been stuffed inside the Hello Kitty toy. Prosecutors argued that the prolonged attacks had ultimately caused her demise. The defense maintained that an overdose could not be completely ruled out. Without a clear medical conclusion, the jury faced a significant legal obstacle. The question was not whether serious crimes had occurred. The question was whether murder had been proven beyond reasonable doubt. And frustratingly, the jury ultimately concluded that it had not. Chan Man Lok, Xing Cho, and Wai Lun were convicted of manslaughter rather than murder. The decision generated considerable discussion because many people struggled to reconcile with that verdict, with the evidence that had been presented throughout the trial. Legally, however, the verdict reflected the uncertainty surrounding the exact mechanism of passing, rather than any disagreement about the maltreatment itself. Justice Peter Nguyen sentenced all 3 men to life imprisonment. During sentencing, he described the case as one of extraordinary cruelty and emphasized the need to protect the public from individuals capable of such behavior. Psychiatric assessments presented during proceedings reportedly described the 3 men as lacking remorse, a factor that further influenced public perception of the case. Ah Fong testified under an immunity agreement. Her testimony had become one of the prosecution's most valuable tools because it allowed investigators to understand events inside the apartment that could not be reconstructed through forensic evidence alone. Without her cooperation, much of the case may have never been uncovered. In the years that followed, the legal story continued to evolve. Leung Shing-cho later succeeded in reducing his sentence to 18 years and was eventually released from prison. In 2022, he was convicted of a violation involving a minor and received a 12-month prison sentence. The conviction brought renewed attention to the case and reopened public discussion about parole, rehabilitation, and long-term risk. Meanwhile, Phan's remains remained in official custody until legal proceedings had concluded. In 2004, her skull was returned to her family and cremated. More than 5 years after her passing, she was finally laid to rest. The building where the crime occurred was eventually demolished in 2012. A hotel now occupies the site, leaving little visible evidence of what once happened there. Yet, despite the passage of time, the case has never disappeared from public memory. Part of that is because of the unusual evidence discovered by investigators. Part of it is because of the involvement of a teenage witness whose decision to speak transformed the entire investigation. And part of it is because the case exposed a hidden world of organized crime, addiction, exploitation, and vulnerable people living on the margins of society. More than 2 decades later, the name Hello Kitty murder remains widely recognized throughout Hong Kong and beyond. But behind the headlines was a real person. Phan Man Yi was not simply the victim in a famous criminal case. She was a young mother who had spent much of her life fighting instability, attempting to build a better future for herself and her son. Her story might never have been fully uncovered had a frightened teenager not walked into a police station and shared information that initially sounded impossible. For investigators, the case demonstrated how a single witness can unlock an entire investigation. For Hong Kong, it became one of the most infamous criminal cases in modern history. Thank you so much for watching. I'm uploading daily true crime and dark content here on this channel, so make sure that you're subscribed, hit like on the video, and also drop a comment so you get shown more of my stuff. Please do be careful out there, and I'll see you tomorrow.